So we'll now continue with these presentations. We'll go right down, we'll finish them all, and then maybe we'll have a short discussion after that, and then we'll look at the readings I asked you to look at for today. I hope, did you bring in our own words? Good, okay.
Hi, I'm Lucy. Today I'm going to be presenting an example of what I believe to be poor political rhetoric. And this is an example from one of President Trump's midterm rallies in Missouri. And he says, "If you don't want America to be overrun by masses of illegal aliens and giant caravans, you better vote Republican." So, like we mentioned last class, political rhetoric is subjective, and I do recognize how this could be perceived as effective to some audiences, namely President Trump's audience, through the pathos and inciting fear, but it did not work for me for several reasons. And the first of which being his use of second person creates an authoritative tone, and it distances himself as the speaker from his audience. It creates a power imbalance between the two. And I don't think this is ever effective in political discourse because, the speaker should be creating a sense of shared stake or common interest or a common goal in something. But instead of doing that, instead of creating a sense of solidarity by portraying this issue as something that we can all take action in, this rhetoric points the finger at his audience by saying, you better vote, you better do something. And it's putting all the blame and responsibility on his audience. And in taking himself out of the picture, he's hurting his ethos and he's not creating a sense of shared stake in something. And also, this statement does have an ad populum fallacy in its provocative diction, such as his use of the words illegal and aliens and caravans, clearly describing groups of people that he wants to marginalize. And he's using this to invoke emotion and even repulsion towards these groups of people in his audience. And this may be effective, it may work for his audience, and it may work to rile them up towards these groups of people and eventually vote, but it is not rhetorically sound. By using these provocative phrases illogically actually hurts his logos and ethos in the long run. Does anyone have any comments or questions?
I'd like to ask whether you think in the statement that you read there's a kind of syllogistic reasoning.
There definitely is. I think he's saying if you vote Republican, America will not be overrun by masses of illegal aliens and giant caravans. And if someone votes Republican, then America will not have these issues.
Yes, it's a kind of if-then, maybe not so much as syllogistic, but if-then. And what's the implication that if you vote for a Democrat?
The implication is that America will be overrun by these things.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. And this kind of political rhetoric is quite common. If you do this, this will or won't happen. And when there's a binary choice, for most voters it's a binary choice. Maybe they'll vote an independent ticket or Green Party or something else, but for most it's a binary choice. The implication is that something bad will happen if you vote for the opponent. And it's a common tactic. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
As the next person comes up, I wanted to mention that there is an advantage in many cases when speaking of not assuming authority, but there is an advantage of assuming confidence. That is to say, you want a leader to be confident and to some degree self-confident. You don't want a leader presumably to be arrogant or dismissive. But you don't want a leader to feel doubt in him or herself. And as soon as a sense of that doubt creeps in, it weakens the person's position. Sometimes authoritative rhetoric carries confidence with it. It's a matter of tone. Sometimes it betokens a kind of arrogance or dismissiveness. How to find that right medium, that sweet spot, where you are instilling confidence rather than alienation is a trick, but good orators manage to do it.
I'm Adam. I'm going to give an example of non-effective political rhetoric. I went to Twitter, as is becoming a very important part, I think, in the youth of America in terms of what they see. A lot of people take that and just run with it. They don't look into it. So it's very effective in many cases because people don't go further than that. Jim Carrey posted a photo of that he drew. He's becoming a pretty well-known artist. He posted a photo of Beto O'Rourke pulling back the curtain on Ted Cruz, and Ted Cruz is kind of diminishing, being kind of taken away from the sunlight because he was being drawn as a vampire. So he was saying, let's pull back the curtains and expose the bloodsuckers, as he was referring to Ted Cruz. So Ted Cruz responded, and this is the non-effective political rhetoric that I found. He said, Hollywood liberals all in for Beto, but, parentheses, self-described socialist, parentheses, Jim Carrey made a mistake here. Vampires are dead, and everybody knows the dead vote Democrat. First of all, it was kind of an incorrectly and not very well made sentence, kind of hard to follow, but really what the problem is that Jim Carrey was calling him the vampire and the bloodsucker, and Ted Cruz is saying the vampires are dead. So he really didn't understand or look into what Jim Carrey was saying at all. So he said, everybody knows vampires are dead, referring to himself if he's talking about what Jim Carrey said, and that the dead vote Democrat. So he's saying, I'm going to vote Democrat. You know, it's just not a very well-made sentence, and it was just completely ineffective if you look at it at all. So.
All right, thank you. Questions? Oh, stay up there. Maybe questions. Vinny?
Thanks. I'm just, as a side note, didn't Jim Carrey respond to it? I don't remember how exactly he did, but I think there was some funny quip he had back.
Yeah, he said something along the lines of, sorry to fluster you. I thought you had better things to do, like suck up to the man that called your wife ugly and accuse your father of murder.
That's what it was.
Oh, dear.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. Just wanted to confirm.
Oh, dear.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Adam. Before we have our next speaker, I feel some kind of intervention is called for here. I want to remind you. A few years ago, I had occasion to read a number of papers in modern psychology about the phenomenon of lying, telling lies. I was writing a paper about an 18th century moralist who wrote about lying, and I thought, let's not make this just historical. Let's look at current research on people lying. Fair enough? So I read a lot of papers on the subject, and there are a lot of papers in psychology and social relations on lying, and here's some of the things I found out. Children learn to lie between the ages of 2 and 4, to consciously lie. It's an interesting fact. Then, shockingly, the most common lie that parents tell children is that if the children don't behave, they will be abandoned or left behind. For instance, if you're with a child in a supermarket or a shopping mall and the child is carrying on, it's apparently the most common thing the parent says that's a lie is, if you don't behave, I'm going to leave you here. This psychologically is not very healthy. I also learned something else reading these studies. When men talk with strangers who are men, they lie more quickly than when women talk with women who are strangers. The men tend to lie within 30 seconds of meeting a strange man. Yes, shocking. And they tend to lie in a way that aggrandizes themselves, even if in a minor way. When women lie, they tend to lie in order to protect someone or something. Now, these again are general trends. These aren't absolutes. Then finally, I wanted to mention this about studies of lying. The place in which lying least occurs is in direct face-to-face contact with someone you have already had some acquaintance with. In other words, you know the person. You're talking with them. You could literally reach out and touch them. It's face-to-face. The incidence of lying or telling untruths in that case goes down. The more mediated a conversation is, the greater the chance of a falsehood entering into it. So that is to say, if you're on the telephone talking with someone, there's a somewhat greater chance that you will not be perfectly honest with them than if you are looking at them face to face. The result of some of these studies showed, in the words of one, that text messages are, quote, a cesspool of mendacity. You all know what mendacity is? Mendacity is a long word for telling lies. This to me is interesting because so much of our public discourse these days, whether it's on Twitter or whether it occurs on television or through text transmission or online, is highly mediated. That is to say, there's some medium that intervenes. And we don't have as much political discourse as public discourse as we used to when, say, before the days of even radio, candidates would go on whistle stops on trains, and they'd stop every couple of miles, and they'd speak with people. And they would do a lot of their campaigning in person. It was very common for people to shake 2,000 to 3,000 hands a day in those cases. And now that's gone out the window. So it's an interesting lesson. I'm not sure what we do with it, but mediation, especially of an electronic distancing kind, tends to increase the temptation to tell untruths. I'm only reporting what various psychological studies I read have to say. And it's one more reason to think that in communication and in debate, very often actually seeing and talking with a person may help honesty on both sides.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Caleb, if we haven't met, and I'm here today to present a piece of what I think is pretty powerful rhetoric. So the 2018 midterm election cycle showed the intense power of rhetoric to both divide on one hand and to bring together on the other. In fact, we saw almost 30 million more votes cast in this midterm election than the 2014 cycle. So I'd like to share with you an example from President Obama's speech in Florida on November 2nd in support of Andrew Gillum and Bill Nelson, both of whom it looks like will have lost. Notice particularly in this example his use of repetition, which actually calls to mind that of Dr. King in his I Have a Dream speech. If you don't like what's going on right now, don't just complain. Don't get anxious and freaked out. Don't throw your hands up in despair. Don't boo. Don't hashtag vote. When you vote for an attorney general and state representatives, they will have the power to protect our voting rights and make sure our criminal justice system treats everybody fairly. When you vote, you have the power to make sure that we strengthen laws that protect women in the workplace from harassment and make sure they're paid for doing the same job, paid the same as men for doing the same job. When you vote, you have the power to make it easier for a college student to afford a college education and harder for a disturbed person to shoot up places where our kids learn and where our seniors gather to worship. When you vote, you have the power to make sure a family keeps its health insurance. You have the power to save somebody's life. That power rests in your hands. And if you get involved, I promise you something powerful happens. Change starts to happen. Hope starts to happen. And with each new steps we take in the direction of fairness and justice, equality and opportunity, hope spreads. It starts rippling. It enters into each of us. We get a sense of what is possible, and we remind ourselves of those better angels of our nature. It's up to you. Let's make history happen right here in Florida. So that's my example from President Obama. I think it's particularly effective in the way it tries to coalesce. It tries to bring people together around a common vision of what could be. Now, Professor Engel specified that this is not a not a partisan exercise, and I agree it is not. However, I think we saw two very stark rhetorical positions in this election cycle. On the one hand, the Democrats thought they would strengthen their position by actually bringing people out to participate in the democratic process. The Republicans did not. I think the Democrats' position was a much stronger rhetorical position in that it is pro-democratic. So that's what I have for you. Thank you so much.
Where does the phrase "better angels of our nature" come from? This is interesting because many good speeches often have in them a phrase that calls to mind an important political past.
Abraham Lincoln said it.
Yes, it's a quotation from Abraham Lincoln, "the better angels of our nature." No reason you should have known that. I thought you might, maybe not. But it's just an example of the fact that you can, in political rhetoric, it's acceptable to quote from someone without actually quoting from them. It's just acceptable in public discourse. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not acceptable in papers written for this or any other course. However, it is acceptable in that context. Very effective use of repetition in this speech. We'll see it again when we look at Margaret Chase Smith's speech. Thank you.
I'm Colton, and I'm presenting what I thought was effective rhetoric. It was during the Georgia campaign for governor, which, by the way, is still going on right now. So if you live in Georgia and you voted absentee, you need to go on the website and make sure your absentee ballot was counted. There's like a 10,000 vote difference, so it matters. But with that preface, this is a quote by Brian Kemp. He said, "Absentee ballots continue to concern us, especially if everybody uses and exercises their right to vote, which they absolutely can, and mail those ballots in. We gotta have heavy turnout to offset that." And I thought this was effective for several reasons. It was given to a particular audience. It was a private event exclusively for potential donors of his. So he was speaking to a very particular audience, and he appeals to them. He says, we have to have a heavy voter turnout to offset that. He's bringing them into his fold, and he's using a pathos appeal to them, appealing to their fear of losing the election. And ultimately, he uses pathos and logos together. The implied logos that he uses is absentee ballots are a kind of vote. If you don't have enough votes, you lose. So we need to offset the absentee ballots that my opponent has. And I was actually on the fence on whether this was effective or ineffective rhetoric, because as Secretary of State, his job is to encourage voting of all kinds. So by saying this and getting it leaked to the public, it somewhat undermines his ethos. But when I looked at the numbers, he was able to outspend his opponent by several orders of magnitude. So I think it was ultimately very effective. Questions, comments?
I have a question, Colton. What he said seems to imply that the absentee ballots will be predominantly cast for the Democratic candidate. How does he know that, and is that correct in Georgia? In Georgia, is there a history of absentee ballots being significantly in the majority for candidates of the Democrat Party?
There's not a history of it, but Stacey Abrams ran largely off of a campaign of getting new voters to sign up. And historically, the absentee ballots actually go Republican, but this year they were slightly Democrat.
I see. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
My name is Caroline, and I'm going to present today a piece of rhetoric that I consider as bad rhetoric. It is an advertisement called Dear Young People, produced by Knock the Vote campaign. I found it on Facebook, but it's also on YouTube, and currently has 600,000 views. This advertisement uses visuals to portray highly conservative, elderly men and women taking turns to speak the following script. Dear young people, don't vote. Everything's fine the way it is. Trump, that was us. He's our guy. Tax cuts for the rich? Hell yeah, I'm rich as hell. Climate change? That's a you problem. I'll be dead soon. Sure, school shootings are sad, but I haven't been in a school for 50 years. I can't keep track of which lives matter. Sure, you don't like it. So you'll like some meme on Instagram. If the weather is nice, maybe you could go on one of those little marches. You might even share this video on Facebook, but you won't vote. You young people never do, but I do. Primaries, midterms, every single election. We'll be there, but you won't, because we're a generation of doers, not whiners, and we're doing great. Initially, I thought that this was a good piece of rhetoric simply because it is effective. It creates and underscores divisions between the elderly and the young. It makes short statements that causes the audience to conclude themselves that the elderly don't care about issues of climate change, school shootings, and protests for equality, that they only care about things that benefit them, and that they are concerted in their efforts to change public policy. And because we come to these conclusions ourselves, we can't directly make a rebuttal that the elderly simply vote more because they're retired. They have more time to. And so I simply thought that because it's effective, it's a good piece of rhetoric. But I thought a little bit more about extreme rhetoric, and I came to the conclusion that this is actually a bad piece of rhetoric. This is because right now our politics are highly polarized, and this piece of rhetoric adds to that polarization. I'm from California, and in California there were this string of violent acts where youth would go around and a random elderly man or woman would be walking down the street and they would strike them down. And while this isn't a direct call for violence or anything like that, it breeds the kind of division and factioning that might lead to that kind of activity. So in sum, it is extremely effective, but not good. Questions?